So today on topic number 2 in Unit 3, we're going to talk about classifying triangles. When we classify triangles, we can do it in two different ways. We can classify by angles, and we can classify by sides, okay? These words should sound a little bit familiar, either from Unit 1 or from previous classes that you've had. So when I ask you to classify the triangle by their angles, there are three different options. We can have a right triangle, an obtuse triangle, or an acute triangle. Let's look at the right triangle first. So if you remember, a right triangle has one right angle. That's exactly one. And from Unit 1, we know that a right angle is 90 degrees. So if I draw a triangle, I know that it has to have one right angle. I'm going to put the box. We learned that again in Unit 1. That means I have a right angle. I know that this triangle is a right triangle. Let's look at these two angles right here, angle 1 and angle 2. I know that all three angles, the 90 plus angle 2 plus angle 1, have to add to 180. Well, if I've already used up 90 degrees here, 180 minus 90 is 90. That means that angle 1 and angle 2 must add to 90 degrees, which means that they have to be acute. So they could be something like 30 and 60. They could be 45 and 45. But what we know is that we have two acute angles. Okay, so a right triangle will have one right angle and two acute angles. Now let's look at an obtuse triangle. So an obtuse triangle has one obtuse angle. And remember, an obtuse angle is greater than 90 or between 90 and 180. Okay? So let's draw an obtuse triangle. I'm going to make my angle look a little bit more open here. Okay? And let's make up an obtuse angle. Let's say that this was 100. Okay? The fact that it has one obtuse angle means that that entire triangle is obtuse. And again, let's look at these angles 1 and 2 over here. If all three angles have to add up to 180, well, 180 minus 100 is 80. So angle 1 and angle 2 have to add up to 80, meaning, again, you're going to have two acute angles as well. Okay? And then last but not least, we have an acute triangle. Okay? And this is a little bit different because all three angles now must be acute, and they have to be less than 90 or between 0 and 90. So if I draw a triangle here, let's say that this angle is 50 and this angle is 60, we're able to actually find that last angle. I'm not sure if it's an acute triangle just quite yet because I need all three angles to be acute. So I'm going to add 50 plus 60, that's 110. I can do 180 minus 110 and get 70. And now I know that last angle is 70. All three angles are acute, so this is an acute triangle. Okay? So whenever you only have two angles, make sure you always find that third one to make sure that it's acute. All right? Now we can classify the triangles by sides. And these we haven't talked about in our class, but they should sound familiar from previous classes. An equilateral triangle. Well, an equilateral triangle, that sounds like the word equal. Okay? And that makes sense that I'm telling you that all three sides have to be congruent, or they have to be equal. Okay? So when I draw a picture here, if I have a triangle, remember when we show things are equal, we use tick marks. So I'm going to put a tick mark on each side saying all three of those angles are congruent. Well, we just learned about the angle side properties. I'm actually going to pause for a second and I'll come back to that. All right, let's go through the rest of them first. So an isosceles triangle has at least two has at least two sides that are congruent. So if I draw a triangle, okay, I'm going to put a tick mark on only two sides and know that that third side now is different. If you wanted to, you could even put two tick marks on this side to show that that third side is completely different. All right? But now I have two sides that are congruent. And then finally, scalene. Scalene says that all three sides have to be different. So when I draw my triangle here, okay, I have one tick mark here. My second side has to have two tick marks, and then my third side has to have three tick marks, showing that all three of those sides were different. Okay? Now let's go back to what I was saying about the angles. So last class we learned that the largest side is across from the largest angle. Well, when I'm looking at this scalene triangle over here, right? If all three sides are different, I'm going to be able to tell you which side's the smallest, which side's the middle, and which side is the largest. So that means that all three angles are going to be different as well. So a scalene triangle has three different sides, but also has three different angles. Okay? If I'm looking at an isosceles triangle, if I went to pick the smallest side, the middle side, and the largest side, I wouldn't be able to distinguish from the two congruent sides that I have over here. Those would be the same. And so what that means is if I have two congruent sides, those angles that are across from them are also going to be congruent. So I'm just going to make it look a little less crazy. These two angles here across from the congruent sides have to be congruent. So I know that isosceles has two congruent sides and two congruent angles. And then last but not least, same thing with an equilateral triangle. If I have three congruent sides, I'm not going to be able to distinguish which side is the biggest or the smallest or the middle. So we know that all three sides here have to be the same. So an equilateral triangle will have three congruent sides and three congruent angles. Okay? I think we can actually figure out what those angles are. Because if I know all three angles have to add to 180, I can just take this 180 and divide by 3 because they're congruent, and that gets me 60. So all three angles in here will be 60. And that will happen for every single equilateral triangle. All right? Let's look at 4 quick examples, and then you can head on to the practice. So in this example, it says classify the triangles by sides and angles. We're going to get to this if possible in the last example. I'll explain what I mean by that, okay? We usually start with angles first. So if I'm looking at this first triangle over here, I'm thinking, all right, let me look at the angles. The only angle that is given to me is this box right here, which we know is 90 degrees. And remember, our options for angles are acute, right, or obtuse. And this right here, this is a right angle. So right away, I only have to have one right angle, so I know that it's a right triangle. Okay? Now let's go by sides. By sides, my options are equilateral, isosceles, or scalene. Right? So my side lengths here are 3, 4, and 5. I'm going to ask myself, are any of those the same? The answer is no. So I know that all 3 side lengths are different, so this is a right scalene triangle. Looking at example number 2, okay? Let's start with angles again. I'm going to look at my 3 angles, 40, 60, and 80. All 3 of those angles are smaller than 90 degrees, which means all 3 angles are acute, which makes this an acute triangle. Okay? Now let's classify by sides if we can. I'm going to look at my sides. There's nothing there, right? I have no side measurements like I do before. But I'm actually going to use the angles to help me figure this out, right? This is the smallest angle, the middle angle, the largest angle. All 3 of those angles are different. So if you have 3 different angles, that meant you had 3 different sides, which means this is also scalene. Okay? Let's look at number 3 here. So number 3, notice I don't have any angle measurements in there, so I'm actually going to start with sides first this time. And if I look at my sides, all of those sides are 16, 16, and 16. They're all congruent, which means this is an equilateral triangle. If we want to go one step further, we know all of the angles in an equilateral triangle are 60 degrees, which means that this is also going to be acute because they are all less than 90. All right? And let's look at example number 4 now. So example number 4, by angles, well, if I'm looking at the angles, they only gave me one of them. They gave me that was 110. And that is bigger than 90, which means it is obtuse. I only need one obtuse angle, so I know this is an obtuse triangle. Now let's think about for sides. Do I have any side measurements given to me? Nope. And I think in the last example, in example 2, when I didn't have sides, we used the fact that all 3 angles were different to say that this triangle was scalene. However, I don't even know these two angles over here either. So I don't have enough information to know for sure that those 2 angles were different or the same. So I'm actually going to say that classifying by sides here is not possible. So let's write down not enough info for sides. You can only classify this by angles, okay? So good luck on your practice, and I'll see you tomorrow in class. Bye.